I'm Allison Jonjak, the Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. These videos are the on-demand recordings of UW Extension and the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association's virtual brown bag lunch series. These monthly sessions offer growers and researchers a way to share timely and relevant information. We hope you'll enjoy and continue to engage with us.
Hi, I'm Tom Lochner, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. We're excited to be a partner with Extension to bring you research-backed resources, tools, and tips to keep Wisconsin marshes productive and profitable.
So thanks everybody for joining the July session of our Cranberry Virtual Brown Bag. This is the last pre-harvest brown bag session, since for August we expect to see everybody who's able to join us at the field day and trade show on August 10th at the Cranberry Research Station. So as we are in this kind of peak in the thick of the growing season, we're going to have Dave Jones give us his Wisconsin views, updates, and what he's seeing in the field. A lot of times we have the timing kind of a third on three presenters. This time we're going to have Dave give his introduction. We're going to have then a kind of researcher grower panel where Wade and I will kind of serve as growers, and Amaya Atucho will serve as the researcher, and we're going to ask questions about how to manage nutrition if you've had physical damage of your vines, for example, from hail. And that's going to take a little longer, and we're going to encourage a lot of questions from the audience in that one. And then finally, Amaya and I will move off to a final topic on frost protecting berries versus frost protecting plants. So I expect this to be a lot of really good material. I will give a couple of housekeeping thoughts, which are keep yourself muted unless you are asking a question. If you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself to ask the question, or you can type in the chat a question either broadly to the whole audience, or if you have a question you want me to ask anonymously, send the question to Allison and I will ask that question on your behalf. We have transcripts, and if you don't see those, you should have a little drop down that lets you add live transcripts. And we're happy to have your video on or off depending on your own personal bandwidth. It's always good to see your smiling faces. So with that, I want to give the control to Tom for a minute to give us a quick welcome from the Growers Association.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Allison, and welcome to everybody this morning, this afternoon. We've been pretty busy here at the association with August coming up. It's a busier time of month than normal for us. Of course, we've got the summer meeting on August 10th at the Wisconsin Cranberry Research Station, and we hope all of you will be able to join us there. We've spent a lot of time doing a lot of work to make this year's event a little bit different than ones in the past. The marsh tours will be approached differently. There'll be the traditional marsh tour, but we'll also have tours that will include stops at research sites on the property, and growers will actually be able to get off the bus and talk to the researchers and hear a presentation. So we've moved the mini clinics out to be on the marsh rather than having them inside a tent or a building, and we thought that'd be much more effective to demonstrate to the growers the type of work that's being done there, but also to give growers a chance to talk with researchers in the field. So that's just one of the many changes we've made, but we're real proud at the foundation that of the facility we have there, and we hope all of you can join us. Just to remind that we are still taking applications for the Wisconsin Cranberry Leadership Development Program. So if you know of anyone who may be a good candidate for that, have them get their application in. If they have questions, or if you have questions, feel free to give Alex Skowinski or myself a call about that. And just finally, a reminder, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of August, we're going to be relocating the offices. We're moving. We're staying in Wisconsin Rapids. We're going to be at 3980 8th Street South, Suite 104. But we think we're going to be able to do it seamlessly, but if there's a little interruption of services as far as phones or email, please bear with us. We're going to try and make it go as well as it can. So again, hope everybody's having a good growing season, and we'll turn it back over to you, Allison, for today's program.
Thank you, Tom. And right away, I'm going to hand things over to Dave Jones, who has got a lot of, as I believe he's reporting up from Manitowish Waters today. So He's been seeing lots of things and is going to share a lot of them with us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks as always, GW Extension, for putting these on. It's great to see a few of you here today. I'm just going to be kind of providing some general observations statewide that I've seen in my own travels over the last several weeks, as well as from conversations I've had with a couple of our larger consultants in the last several days. Just kind of giving you a general handle on what we're seeing out there right now. Let's see, there we go. On the docket today, we're going to start with talking a little bit about blooms and trends in vine growth. I'm going to touch on what we feel we saw for statewide bee activity this year. We're going to talk a little bit about general trends that we're seeing in fruit set and grower fertilizer usage, though I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder. We're going to leave the technical discussion certainly over to Amaya. General insect trends from mid-June through mid-July and how that pertains to some of the decisions that growers are going to be making the next couple of weeks, and then a little bit of looking ahead, what we're hoping to see, a couple of things we're going to be watching out for as we get closer and closer to that month of August. All right, so first thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is all that side shooting we were worried about when Pam did such a nice job of chatting us through that scenario during the last brown bag. So of course, as we all know, particularly in central Wisconsin, we saw a lot of vegetative axillary bud break early in the season. And a lot of places, these buds broke and started to elongate at a much faster rate than our fruiting buds. And given that we had a widespread hail event on April 12th, generally, at first, we thought that perhaps it was solely the hail that was to blame for all of the side shooting that we saw. And certainly, I fell into that category in the early going, but the further we went through it, the more we realized this was not the only reason we had this happen this year. We saw the same level of axillary bud break, vegetative buds, I should say, on sites that we know for a fact had no hail on April 12th as that did. Generally, what happened in the aftermath, since when we last talked about this, is that most beds in Central carried both a strong flush of these axillary vegetative buds and ended up having a very strong bloom. So certainly a pleasant surprise on that front. Now, some marshes certainly did experience hail damage, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion on that. However, that is not the sole reason we saw this phenomenon this year. And in spite of some concern, it looks like beds seem to have dealt with this phenomenon quite well. And early going, it looks like the potential is pretty nice. In general, the trend that we saw statewide is observable in more often in central Wisconsin, and it's more observable in older established beds, but it was present to some degree, but not a whole lot of link to variety. It just seemed to be more associated with older established beds this past season, but these are just anecdotal observations. In terms of vine growth trends, like I said, older established beds really have shown that they came into the season with a lot of vigor. This is certainly something we've seen, particularly in Stevens. We had that push of axillary vegetative growth, we had a big bloom, and we also saw early production of lateral vegetative runners. And we've seen this even in locations prior to the onset of any fertilizer usage at all. And that was something that was quite a bit of a surprise, particularly given the size and strength of the bloom. Bloom itself was slow and steady this year, compared especially to a year like last year, where it felt like bloom went by in about a week. This year, bloom did move, but not quite as quickly. And we still do see some bloom hanging around in later varieties, later beds, certainly here up in Manitowish, where I'm visiting today, but absolutely in Central, a couple of later sites, we're still seeing some bloom too. One surprise, I would say, in the last couple of weeks has been that quite a few established beds, certainly true in a lot of Stevens acreage in central Wisconsin, growers ended up backing off what they might have expected to use on nitrogen in spite of what looks to be a fairly good bloom and fruit set, because the beds themselves were showing early signs of overgrowth. So a lot of dark, deep emerald green, stretched out upright growth, reddening tips, early production of lateral vegetative runners, even prior to the addition of extra nitrogen to the system. So in spite of a decent looking crop at most of these sites, we are having reports all over Central of growers backing off and shutting these beds down for the year sooner than they would have originally expected. So that's been a little bit of a surprise. Modern hybrids in general seem to have bloomed heavily. They seem to be set fairly heavily. Sizing so far seems to be relatively uniform statewide. I'm seeing the same thing up north today, have seen the same in central Wisconsin throughout the week. Generally, modern hybrids this year have looked pretty good. The nitrogen draw as a result has been, grower observations been that it's both been very large and that it was very abrupt. When that crop started pulling on nitrogen, it really started happening quick. Vines would go from a nice dark emerald green to a pale green, looking like they needed another shot of fertilizer very quickly, often in just 24 to 48 hours. So many grower reports are hustling to keep the fertilizer going and kind of keep up with that developing crop in the last 14 days. Flipping over to bee activity in 2022, general consensus is that central Wisconsin had very good bee activity, a little bit more sporadic in the north. Reports have been a bit more variable. Generally, quality of pollination up north seems to have been decent, but it has appeared to be a little bit more sporadic and not quite as consistently good. But central Wisconsin this year definitely had very nice pollination weather. Looking at some of the factors that we associate with good bee weather, consistent sunshine, weather in the 80s, very little precipitation during daylight hours, not really a significant number of heavy rain showers or storms during the daylight hours when the bees are actively foraging. And these conditions held relatively steady during both peak bloom for hybrids and Stevens. And I think one other indicator, perhaps a little bit more of a humorous indicator, but maybe what you'd call the sweep net index. It was not a fun year to be swinging a sweep net out during bloom in central Wisconsin. A lot of bees, angry bees, ended up in that net, which is usually a good sign. They were out there, they were definitely working, and they were there in high numbers on most days. All right, moving over to some insect trends, insect pest trends, I should say, over the past month. This year in central Wisconsin, we've seen a very strong flight of sparg, both numerically high and longer in duration. Peak flight has been going for 2 clean weeks, and this week, we're into a 3rd consecutive week at a lot of marshes of what we would call a high flight, really no sign of a decline at quite a few of our sites. We did see a sign of an early decline in sparg flight this week at some marshes, but certainly across central Wisconsin, there are many marshes that are into their 3rd week of pretty strong flight. So we are seeing a drawn out level of activity from this pest this year. Fruitworm flight in general has been a little bit more moderate numerically week to week, but it has also been drawn out. We've been sustaining a pretty respectable flight at most of our trapline sites for 2 to 3 weeks. Again, into a 3rd consecutive week of moderate to high activity with not a lot of sign of slowing down at many of our sites. We did see an overall downward trend this week, but that was very dependent on the marsh. Some marshes did see that downward tick and others pretty much held steady this week. So what does this mean? Well, in the next couple of weeks, really in the next several days in central Wisconsin, growers are going to be making a decision on whether or not they want to treat the marsh a 2nd time for fruitworm and sparg. Unlike last year, we had a lot of early heat, things synced up in terms of our sparg and fruitworm flight. This year, we really are not seeing that trend. And so this year is probably going to end up being a 2-spray year at many marshes in central, even at some sites that are not necessarily used to seeing that level of sparg. Interestingly, we've seen that higher flight even at marshes historically over the last several years that we have not really seen that happen. So unfortunately in central, this is definitely shaping up to be a 2-spray fruitworm sparg year, I would say at the majority of sites. As always, there are a few that are light for whatever reason and are not going to have to do it, but unfortunately it is looking like it's going to be a 2-spray year at a lot of marshes. Our old enemy flea beetle is back, unfortunately. I was certainly hoping, and I know talking to a couple of other consultants, certainly was hoping that the early delay in early delay in onset of other insect pests would be associated with perhaps a slower start to flea beetle. Sadly, this has really not been the case. We're starting to see numbers spiking up at historical hotspots right around the same time as we have the last couple of years. So unfortunately, activity of this pest seems to be pretty much on par with what we've seen the last 2 years. Some historical hotspots this week, multiple reports, including some within our own IPM program of 20 sweep sets with more than 50 flea beetle per set, which is a very high sweep. So unfortunately, early going, at least not looking like it's going to be a particularly low year for flea beetle. Growers looking to conserve their diazinon sprays for August. I want to emphasize doubly here, please check with your handler. What you can and can't use in July is going to depend heavily on where you're sending your fruit. Certainly, we're seeing growers looking at imidan and Actera for the month of July before turning their attention to diazinon in the month of August. But double check where you're with the handler that you work with and make sure that you are compliant with the extra restrictions, because most of these materials carry added restrictions pretty much with all local handlers. As always, this pest is really spotty. We're seeing it this year. We see it every year, even within a single bed. You can hit huge numbers in one corner of a bed, see very little in the other end of the bed, and even the best scout in the world may not get lucky and walk in the right bed in a given week. So this is a really good example of how important it is to take a drive around the marsh every day or two and just keep an eye out. And especially with the heat we've had, we do observe that flea beetle can go from relatively low numbers to flaring hot spots very quickly, sometimes in the junction between the visit from a scout. So just a nice reminder, something most people already do anyway, but certainly a good excuse to take a drive and take a look. Last slide here, just looking ahead. Just a couple of comments, things that we're going to be kind of watching for in the next couple of weeks, a couple of things we're going to be hoping for in the next several weeks. First comment would be watching that nitrogen in the next couple of weeks. Certainly don't want to make too many comments on the crop, but growers are reporting they feel they are carrying pretty decent crop potential right now. Large crops are heavier, they tend to pull deeper into the canopy. If we do end up with a large crop in beds and they pull deep in the canopy, if we overgrow, that large crop will get buried, and it can get buried pretty deep if we have a heavy flush of upright growth or lateral runners. And unfortunately, crops that sit deep can trend towards more rot, particularly if we end up with a abnormally wet or hot August and early September. Grower experiences generally that these conditions combined with a deep sitting crop can be associated with a higher incidence of cranberry fruit rot. We also know from experience that crops that sit deep, particularly large crops, can struggle with color, and this can certainly be compounded if you have a significant amount of overgrowth covering up those vines. So if those berries can't see sunlight, we typically see problems with color development. So certainly, as we are looking at shutting down nitrogen at most marshes in the next 10 to 14 days statewide, that final shot or two, certainly a good idea to pay very careful attention to the status of those vines in addition to the strength of the crop to ensure that we don't overgrow. Looking ahead, we're going to hope that this warm weather continues. We're also going to hope for low to average rainfall. Certainly, we don't want a drought, but always hope that we don't have an abnormally high level of precip in August and September either. And as always, hoping we don't get any hail. So far, we have dodged a couple of pretty big bullets as an industry. We're going to hope that that continues. Currently, fruit set potential certainly looks to be there, but we all know we've got a long way to go. We still need size, we still need color. So it's about all we can really say at this point in time. With that, I think I'm pretty much pushing up to the end of my allotted time. So I will turn it back over to Allison. If I don't have time for questions, that's totally fine. Maybe people could throw them in the chat or whatever Allison deems will work.
We can either, we can take a question or two if we've got one. And I appreciate that, Dave. Thank you for all of those thoughts on the sparg hatch to the flea beetle already rearing its head and into the side shooting questions and the nitrogen questions, since that is a pretty good tee up to what we're going to discuss with Wade and Amaya here in the latter half of our brown bag. With that, I guess we've made it to 1 o'clock, and I know everyone has a lot going on, whether you are about to do your first couple of passes of control of flea beetle. I hate to hear how early that's getting started, but I can let everyone head off into their Fridays. Just for quick reminders, hope to see everybody at the Mini Clinics on the Marsh on the Summer Field Day and Trade Show. That's August 10th at the research station, and Alex has all the information about that. Yeah, looking forward to a wonderful remainder of the growing season here. Everyone go ahead and send questions whenever you have them. I'm always glad to hear from you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.